Good morning and welcome to the second webinar in the Centre for Army Leadership's new virtual speaker series. 2 weeks ago we were joined by Major Russ Lewis, MC, who spoke about the loneliness of command and his time as a company commander in southern Afghanistan in 2008. And for those of you that were unable to join us, that presentation is available through our website or on our YouTube channel, so do take a look. This morning it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Mr. Gareth Bloomfield. Gareth is a good friend of the Centre for Army Leadership, having worked with us now for several years on a number of projects, not least more recently working in support of the National Health Service. Gareth, a former police detective, now works as an academic at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where he has been developing the future leaders of the British Army for a number of years. Widely respected in his field, he has a wealth of experience in organisational, neurological, clinical, and indeed military psychology, as well as a depth of research in resilience. And it is on that subject that he's here to talk to us today: positive psychology and mental resilience lessons. Gareth, great to have you on board once again. Over to you.
Hi, welcome to the Centre of Army Leadership webinar on psychological resilience. The actual title here is Positive Psychology and Mental Resilience, but really what we're looking at are the ingredients of psychological resilience. And we're going to be doing the what, the why and the how with some key points. We'll do the key points and we'll come back to the why issues in terms of its importance if we've got time. Before we look at what is mental resilience and the building blocks for that, a little bit about the bald fat bloke standing in front of you on this webinar. Am I resilient? Probably not. Does that make me qualified to talk about this particular subject? A little bit. I am a psychologist here at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. I have learnt quite a lot about resilience during my journey to be a psychologist. I came through school, got absolutely nothing. Came through school and failed A-levels. I think I got an E at pottery in A-levels. This was before, I'm 51 years old, so this is 1980s. This is before really dyslexia assessments and special needs assessments were any good. And it wasn't till later, when I managed to get myself back into university, that I was diagnosed as being severely dyslexic. But I used my practical skills. I trained as a blacksmith, believe it or not, which meant that I was welding things and building things, but also learning about how machines work, etc. That became important. I joined the Royal Marines Reserve at the time, and then I did my Potential Officers course, Admiralty Interview Board, and I got sent out on operations in the early 90s with the Royal Marines. But because of the skills that I had, I thought that this was going to be an opportunity for me to lead, but in actual fact it became an opportunity for me to fix generators on operations. But I went back to university. I found myself in a situation where I was learning far more about what humans do, how humans do things, and I joined the police service. I was detective for 10 years with Hampshire Police, and worked with Special Branch and Regional Crime Squad. I did my sergeant's exams. That became my real first chance to be a leader. But actually, I focused a huge amount on the task in front of me and less about the individual and a team. And that became really something that I have learnt a great deal from, because I believe now, looking back at things, that I was a toxic leader. So I'm going to look at resilience and what is mental resilience, what is psychological resilience, the building blocks from it, from a leadership perspective, because of course this is Centre of Army Leadership webinar. I retrained as a clinical psychologist, but one of the things that helped me learn more about resilience was that during that training I was sitting down with a patient in an adult mental health environment. That patient was suicidal. I realised that myself and the member of social services that were there, we realised that this person was probably going to go out of this building and take their own life. I ran upstairs, 3 flights of stairs, got myself a risk assessment sheet, which is about an A2 sheet of paper, ran back downstairs, ran back into the room, and that's the last thing I know. I fell over, I had a full epileptic seizure, never been epileptic, had an epileptic seizure in front of this patient, and was carted off to hospital in an ambulance. I was later diagnosed with a brain lesion. That's the first stage in terms of, you call it a lesion before you call it a tumour. And I found myself changing in terms of behaviours. My memory went, I was on a lot of drugs. Life fell apart for me in terms of myself, how I perceived myself, how I remembered myself, and that particular part of my life was very, very difficult. Did that help me become resilient now? Possibly. And what we're going to look at is about how experiences make you resilient or not. One thing I would say about resilience at the moment in terms of the topic itself is that it's a money spinner. It's a money spinner because there's lots of commercial organisations out there offering resilience training. And resilience training, I think, is overcomplicated. It doesn't need to be complex. In fact, there's a very simple equation that we've come up with here at Sandhurst that enables us to see actually how psychological resilience is pretty simple. So it's a money spinner at the moment. They overcomplicate things, I think, some of these companies. And of course, there's a lot of organisations who are stealing stuff that has come from all sorts of different environments. So there's things that have come from NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, which those of you who are scientists will know that there is has very, in terms of academic rigour, it's not very academically rigorous. So therefore we'll take NLP and we'll put that in on a shelf somewhere. We're not going to be referring to anything from there. There are people taking things from mindfulness, from medical research, clinical research. I will be taking things that have come from research-led practices. This is evidence-based. So the things that I'm going to talk about today have got some evidence behind them, and I will reference them as far as possible during this presentation as well. If you're going to use some of my stuff in your presentations later, having watched this, do me a favour, then reference me as well. Reference Sandhurst, reference the work that we do here, because it's good stuff. Okay, so let's go into the what is mental resilience. So you've got to think about the word resilience, resilio. It actually comes from a Latin word meaning to spring back, to spring back. So if we think about to spring back and we think about the ability then to recover quickly, that becomes a major part in terms of what is psychological resilience. The ability to recover quickly. After what? After failure. After something that has gone wrong or some sort of pressure that has put you under enormous strain. So how do we adapt to that failure, and how do we learn to do something different as a result of what we've done? So think about it in terms of a car spring, because that's what we're thinking about. Resilio, spring back. A car spring goes over potholes. So we go through potholes throughout our life. We go through these potholes, and Sometimes we spring back, sometimes we reform the shape that we had, but other times we break. We don't get that form back, or we come out of it a different shape. So the experiences that I've talked about throughout my life, whether it's been through experiences in the Royal Marines and the police, in the NHS, where I trained as a clinical psychologist, and here at Sandhurst, but also clinical experiences for myself in terms of falling over and then being diagnosed with a brain tumour. Do they obviously have an effect on you? All these experiences have an effect on you, and you come out of that a different shape. Hopefully you don't break, but if you do break, how do you then recover from that situation? So those are the examples that we look at. I've come up with some definitions. There's 2 definitions on the screen here. This is the first one, and just have a look at the words that are in bold up here. Develop the ability to prepare quickly and adapt to changing conditions. Psychologically withstand and rapidly recover from disruptions and failure. So that's one of the definitions that's a working definition for us here at Sandhurst in terms of training young leaders. The other one is this. Improving resilience means developing psychological defence mechanisms. And the bit in bold there, positively influence others under your command, under their command, to do the same. So really, resilience is not just about you. From a leadership perspective, it's about how do you encourage people around you to be more resilient? How do you help that to actually happen? So that becomes important. We're going to go into the neurological science behind that later in this presentation. Let's have a look at how. So how can we teach and coach and improve mental resilience? How can we actually do those things? So if you look at it from a military perspective, we have a number of things that go on. Clearly, at the top of this is our primary care function. And actually this resembles civilian world as well. The primary care function, that is, you go to see your doctor, you go to see your GP, and you talk about being stressed, you talk about feeling anxious, or you've got yourself into a spiral where you're beginning to feel depressed. That becomes actually the front line in terms of picking up on people having broken in terms of resilience. Then comes our systems within the military, becomes the chaplaincy system. Chaplaincy systems have been around for years and years within the armed forces, and generally they work very well because they tend to be individuals who are outside the chain of command. A senior non-commissioned officer or someone in the chain of command just picks up on something and says, "Padre, chaplain, could you go and have a word with this individual?" But of course, actually, the people who are really picking these things up are the senior NCOs within our organisation. And think about that in terms of your own workplace, whether that is in a blue chip organisation, for example. There should be occupational health. There should be obviously the opportunity for people to go and visit their primary care services. You might not have chaplaincy services in terms of pastoral care that we do, but there should be coaches around. There should be people who are really being able to pick up on people's breaks and resilience, and you as a manager, as a leader, should be picking up these things as well within your people. So I've got a couple of questions for you. Just take a minute really just to consider this. What are the ingredients that make a human being more likely to be psychologically resilient? Just take 1 minute now to answer that question. Think about it in terms of making a cake. What would be the ingredients that went in the bowl to make the cake? Think of 3 things. Ingredients that make humans more likely to be psychologically resilient. Now, some of you might be thinking about experiences. Some of you might be thinking about parenting. Some of you might be thinking about all sorts of different ingredients that go into this pot to make somebody more psychologically resilient. How about thinking about it the other way? Let's think about 3 things from this point of view as well. What are the multiple factors that often lead to breaks in human psychological resilience? Now, I'm using the word human because, of course, we know, any of you have got a dog or a cat, will know that there are things that will freak them out, that will spook them out, and will actually break their resilience in some way. So think about what breaks human psychological resilience. And there are multiple factors. If you think about that, think about the breaks in psychological resilience. This becomes relatively easy, really, in terms of thinking about, I don't know, think about all the films you've seen. Think about the films that you've seen, James Bond, where he's being tortured. Maybe there are films that you've seen where people gradually get worse and worse in terms of their mental health, and then part of the film is that they recover, or someone comes along and recovers them. Even cartoons that kids see, animated cartoons. Do you remember, many of us who are watching this will remember watching Toy Story. Toy Story 1. Buzz Lightyear. Buzz Lightyear was that individual who seemed to be ultimately resilient, superhuman and optimistic, but he crashed. But there was someone who came along and built his resilience back up. But what are the multiple factors that often break humans? So let's think about that in terms of what those multiple factors are. I call them building blocks, okay? There are building blocks that you need as a human being to be able to operate to your peak performance. You also just need them to be resilient, to be a stable, resilient individual. The first one of those blocks, well, think about it like this. If I was going to torture you, the first thing I would do if I was going to capture you and try and break your psychological resilience without maybe laying a finger on you, what would I do? The first thing I'd do is I'd deprive you of sleep. Deprivation of sleep means that your neurological functions are unlikely to operate in the way that they should. So sleep deprivation becomes a major, perhaps the major building block of human psychological resilience. We need to have good quality, quantity sleep. Second thing I do, what would I want to do if I was going to break your psychological resilience? I'd deprive you of sleep, and I'd probably put you in a cardboard box with a little letterbox size hole in it, which meant that you couldn't see or deal with anybody. I'd take away all social contact, all social support. We are a cooperative species. We are a social species. Think about human beings. The only reason that we're still alive as a species is because we cooperate with each other. We are a social species. We have to do things together to be able to survive. This is being filmed during the COVID-19 shutdown. So it's April 2020, and we're in a situation where people are conforming with each other, ultimately to achieve the same goal. But that's the only reason we survive, is because we work together. Now, human beings, therefore, are designed to be social creatures. You take away my social interaction with people, you're taking away a big part of what it means to me to be a human being. Now, you can live alone. You can live in isolation. You could live in a house and with 14 cats slightly smelling a wee, but you're not going to survive very long. What we know about people who isolate themselves like that is that the ventricles, the creases in your neurological system in your brain, tend to open up. The ventricles open up. And that means you're going to die young. So social isolation becomes another building block that if I do that to you, that's going to break your psychological resilience. Third one here then is about your physical health and well-being. I mean, there's lots of research coming out on this at the moment in terms of things like gut health. So even when it comes down to eating the right foodstuffs that make your gut work properly, that has this relationship where it's sending signals back to your brain, that's helping you function and be more resilient. But also, of course, the health of your heart, how much body mass you're carrying, how much body fat you've got, your blood sugar levels, all those sorts of things. Are you fit and healthy? So if I deprive you of sleep, if I take away all your social contact, and you find yourself injured in some way that might even be causing you pain and disrupting your sleep in itself, then those three factors cause major scars on resilience. Then we've got my ability to achieve goals, goal achievement. I want to actually achieve things in my life. I want to be doing something, to have a purpose. If I'm not achieving things, if I'm continually frustrated, then that's going to have a marked effect on my resilience as well. And perhaps one of the most important things as well on this building block list is cognitive strategies, the cognitive thought patterns, the thought patterns that we use that actually keep us strong. And one of those is optimism that we'll go on to. So these building blocks, if I take sleep away, the whole thing falls down. If I take your social interaction away, the whole thing falls down. The stability of this building block is based on those two things. But take one of them away and the whole thing will be out of balance. And what I've done is produced a simple equation. So it's simply these building blocks, you add them together, and that's what equals psychological resilience. So if you're going to use that, reference that for us and the work that we do here at Sandhurst. So I'm going to reference some of the people that I've got some of these things from. The physical and health resilience, there's some great work by a group of researchers headed by Gang Wu, and you can look that up on the internet and see the type of work that they've done. You can also look for Dr. Chris Cox and his work on psychosocial collective resilience. That is the resilience that we get from being with other people and working as a team. And of course, one of the most popular books at the moment, if you go into bookshops, you'll find Matthew Walker's book, Professor Matthew Walker's book on sleep, on why we sleep. It's an excellent book, well worth a read. But sleep is really enhancing our neurological performance. And the other one that I'd say, which has influenced the work that I do here at Sandhurst, has been the cognitive patterns that have been highlighted by Professor Martin Seligman, particularly a book called Learnt Optimism, which is an excellent book. And to get the building blocks of this equation, then cognitive patterns is one of those things that we need to look at. I'm going to thank Simon Toy from Performance Associates, who's allowed me to use this grid, which is a way of illustrating how optimism works. This is the work of Martin Seligman, but it's produced in this grid format, which makes it a little bit easier to see. Now, the important thing here is about how we deal with failure. That's the second row there with the red borders on. How we deal with failure. Now, if we deal with failure in a way where we beat ourselves up, if you're a pessimist and you beat yourself up, if, say, on the last row there, you say to yourself, I did that. That was me. That was my fault. And that's always going to happen now, and it's going to affect everything that I do. If you fall into that sort of trap in how you think about things that go wrong in your life, then you are going to fall down. And actually, we learn this. So my example would be giving a small child a glass of milk. So you give Hannah, who's 7 years old, a glass of milk, and you say to Hannah, don't spill the milk. Here's the milk, don't spill the milk. Yes, go and watch the TV, but don't spill the milk. Hannah's thinking, mustn't spill the milk, mustn't spill the milk, mustn't spill the milk, and inevitably what happens, she spills the milk. And then the parent comes along and says, Hannah, you idiot! Every time I give you milk, you spill it on the carpet. This carpet is covered in stains that you have created because you can't keep things in your glass or keep things on your plate. That's one interaction with a parent over Hannah's 20 years at home. She's 7 years old, and she's already learning that when something goes wrong like that, it's her fault. I'm an idiot. And it always happens. And it affects everything that I do because it's all over the carpet. The evidence is everywhere I see. Or there's the alternative to this. The alternative to this is a parent who teaches the child a different form of explanatory style, because this is what Martin Seligman was referring to, how we explain things to ourselves, explanatory style. Others have called it attributional style. In failure, you say, okay, there's all sorts of reasons why that went wrong. So I say to Hannah, oh, did the carpet jump up and bite you? Hey, don't worry about it. Okay, it's just a little bit of milk. It's not a problem. Let's go. Come on, let's go and get a cloth. Let's go together, get a cloth. Let's clear it up. That's not a problem. Let's get you some more milk in your glass. Yes, sit down, watch the telly. No problem. Okay, it's not your fault. It's just a blip. It's just a temporary thing, and it need not affect anything else. That's actually an easy thing for us parents to teach our children. But if you've grown up in a household where actually you've learned a cognitive style where you blame yourself and the future doesn't look very good, and actually all around you is going very wrong, then actually in situations like Sandhurst, you're not going to cope very well, because actually a lot of the training that we do within the military is geared up for failure, is geared up to actually put you in situations where it goes wrong. So the situation goes wrong and we need you to be able to recover quickly. We need you to be in the mindset to be able to then prove yourself next time. And if you're saying to yourself, oh, I'm an idiot, I'm never going to be able to do this, then your cognitive strategy is already undermining your resilience, your ability to adapt, your ability to be able to recover quickly. We need senior NCOs, we need junior NCOs, we need young officers and senior officers and commanding officers, all to have this underlying principle of, yeah, we plan for the worst, but actually what we hope for and how we communicate is with optimism. When something does go wrong, we say, okay, we can learn from this, we can take this apart, we can make sure that this doesn't happen again, because it's just a blip, it's just a one-off, and it need not affect anything else. If you're another type of leader, then actually I don't want to work with you. Because if you're going to blame me, if you're going to tip my world upside down and take away my hope that the future looks any rosier, then actually I don't really want to work for you. So cognitive strategies are really important. And actually what we do within the military, what we do within the wider army at the moment is we've of course got a wider mental health strategy which impinges upon this work. But actually you have to look at some of the things that have gone wrong. The RAF had themselves bitten by something that didn't work for them. They tried to put something in place that tried to look at psychological performance and resilience, and it didn't seem to work very well. We, at the moment, are running from Army HQ the soldiers' mental resilience training. So it's called OpSmart, Soldiers Mental Resilience Training, and some of the things they look at are indeed cognitive strategies. These cognitive strategies are about how you look at some of the things that are going on around you. So positive thinking skills in terms of looking at the positive outcomes of things. Your emotional regulation, recognizing when your anxiety levels have got higher or your emotions are showing themselves in a different way, perhaps in terms of anger or other things. Your pain tolerance, the positive imagery that you might use, and how you rehearse things in your mind and how you push those things over. But those are cognitive strategies that are there to try and get somebody to perform better. Now, this all then comes down to us achieving goals. Because if we're looking at optimism and pessimism, actually what we're looking at is about achieving the goals within our life. And one of the things that we worked on is coaching strategies here at Sandhurst for members of staff. If you're going to break my resilience, you're going to take away the ability for me to achieve my goals. And that becomes important within a training environment and within a work environment, is understanding, why am I doing this? Why am I being told to dig another hole? Why am I being told to do a section attack for the third time? Why am I being told to do this? I've got to understand why I'm being told it, why I'm being asked to do something. So if you think about the person who's being trained and the training staff, there's got to be some overlap between these goals. My goals and your goals ought to overlap. If my goals are very different to your goals, then I'm sorry, I don't want to be within this organisation. I do not want to be within this team because I want to be doing something else. And you might find my resilience weaker because I'm doing something that I don't either understand why I'm doing it or because I just don't want to do it. So goal achievement is about understanding what it is that people around you want to achieve, but also communicating what it is that you're trying to achieve and how that fits in with them. Then the next thing, this slide's quite busy. I don't like busy slides, but I'm going to try and get this down to a better level. Think about it in this way. If I've got a good belief about myself, if I've got a strong belief about myself, which underpins my confidence, that is going to lead me to have an expectation of success, how I imagine success or failure. So I've got to have a firm, strong belief in myself to imagine success. That will then give me a positive mood. If that positive mood is good and a positive attitude, I'm likely to undertake behaviours and get results as expected. Then how I look at those results, I've got to have some optimism about that and say, well, I could probably do that again, and it will probably raise my self-esteem in some way. And if that raises my self-esteem, I look at it in terms of, well, how can I use that now to make myself better at what it is that I do? So this is a cycle, if you like, in terms of if there is some control that an individual has over what it is that they can achieve, these are the significant factors that are involved. Now, these are based on Agen's work on the theory of planned behaviour. It was initially a theory, but there's been some really good research, particularly in healthcare, around this particular theory and how it actually comes to life. You have a goal that you want to achieve. There's got to be beliefs. There's got to be expectations. That creates in itself a mood and attitude. Now, it's really easy for us, particularly within the military, to focus on the two boxes in red, which are about behaviours and about results. We want the right behaviours, we want results. Well, actually, we're focusing on the wrong things. It's great to have good results, but actually if you've got individuals who are achieving goals that they want to achieve, and they've got a good self-belief, they've got good expectations about themselves, therefore they're generating a positive attitude about what it is they're doing, the actions, the behaviours, the results will look after themselves. Actually, what you've got to do as a leader in terms of boosting the psychological resilience of your team and the individuals within your team is to ensure that they recognise that their optimism, their self-esteem, their beliefs, their expectations all generate a mood and attitude towards achieving something. If you focus on those things, you're more likely to have a more psychologically resilient team. So we've done cognitive patterns and we've done goal achievement. So those are two elements there at the top of that building block picture that I had for you earlier on. Well, let's think about some of the underlying principles that go on to form this. This is a picture of my brain. When people see pictures of brains, what we do know from research is that it tends to give it some sort of credibility, which is weird, isn't it? So if you're trying to sell something which is brain food, put a picture of a brain on it. People are much more likely to think it's credible as brain food, just because there's a picture of a brain on it. Well, here's a picture of a brain. Am I trying to make this presentation more credible? No, what I'm trying to do is trying to bring to life the structures of the brain and actually how these impact upon us. So, as you see in the centre of the brain here, you see my little red dot. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. But this bulbous type shape in the middle of the brain is my brain stem. In that brain stem is my stress responses, the things that will help me deal with the anxiety. Now think about stress as being something that's happening right now. Think about anxiety as something that's happening potentially in the future. The brainstem doesn't really think about the future. The thing that thinks about the future is the bit just in front of it. This bit in the front of it is called the prefrontal cortex. Now, none of this has to be very complex at all. Cortex roughly means layer, okay? So I'm really oversimplifying it, but cortex means layer, okay? Prefrontal cortex means it's the bit before the bit at the front. The bit before the bit at the front, this prefrontal cortex, has a conversation with the brainstem. That is, it is firing the axons, the neurons that spike the dendrites, and all this chemical interaction between the billions and billions of brain cells that you've got. Now, thinking ahead. Thinking ahead. Thinking ahead becomes actually one of the major sources of anxiety, because anxiety is about what might be just about to happen. So maybe I'm just about to give a presentation in front of 100 people. This could go horribly wrong. I could look an idiot. Oh my God, is this going to work right? Is this? There could be all sorts of things that I'm thinking that would be then sparking elements within my brainstem, my amygdala, my locus coeruleus, and my pituitary gland. This HPA axis of stress that is causing a spike in adrenaline, cortisol, and putting my heart rate up and making me sweat. But actually, I'm creating that myself by thinking about the future. The way that we think about the future has a major impact upon our stress levels. Now, I know that you're thinking ahead now because you have a bit of your brain which is on the left-hand side, your verbal cortex, your verbal layer. If that gets damaged, where mine was damaged through the condition that I had, begin to say things that aren't right, that might seem wrong, that might even be inappropriate. But it also allows you to think about what's coming next. If you use that in conjunction with your prefrontal cortex, the bit at the front of your brain, this bit at the front, then I can predict what's going to happen next. So I know that you're thinking ahead now because you're already finishing my, I don't have to say very, and you'll just finish the. I thought I could do the whole presentation, but it wouldn't be that. You're filling in the gaps. You're filling in the gaps in the best way that you can because you're thinking about what happens next. You think far quicker than I can talk. You read far quicker than I can talk. So you're banging away much quicker. So you think ahead in terms of nanoseconds, seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks. Why are you watching this video? Why are you watching this webinar? Why are you involved in this? Are you thinking that in some point in the future it might be helpful? Are you thinking it might be good for your career? Are you thinking there are some little tools and techniques that you could take away? Are you thinking that there's some stuff you could use in your own presentations? You're thinking ahead. You're thinking ahead. This thinking ahead becomes the bit that allows us to be fully functioning human beings, but also is the thing that creates anxiety within us. And sometimes that conversation between what's going to happen next and what's happening in the brainstem lights up at incredible levels and takes over. So on the top left-hand side of this slide, there's two pictures here. There's one of somebody who's afraid of spiders and somebody on the right who's not afraid of spiders. And what you can see is within the MRI scanning, what they've done is they've filtered out a lot of the background data and just picked up the most powerful data. And what you can see is that the person on the left-hand side, who's in the scanner, who has been shown a picture of spiders, what's happened is their brainstem has hijacked the rest of their brain. That means that the person is presented with something as an image and they go, oh my God, but then goes into an automatic response. Now, some people call it fight and flight, but there's one F before fight and flight, and that's freeze. Every animal freezes. If you don't freeze, you die. Dodos found that out. So freeze, fight or flight obviously comes from the brainstem, but actually what's happening is that the blood flow, oxygen levels, energy levels within the brain are swarming towards the center of the brain. So that person on the right hand side who's not afraid of spiders is somebody who is fully functioning human being. The person on the left, their amygdala, locus coeruleus and their pituitary gland has been totally hijacked. That's the stuff in the brainstem which is pushing out all those chemicals, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, to save that person's life. They won't be able to think about anything else. On the bottom image, there's an image of somebody suffering from PTSD or panic disorder. And the two are very similar. And again, what you see is that once the panic disorder or the post-traumatic stress response has been fired up within the scanner, is that the center of the brain is really hijacking the rest of the brain. There is some outline strong activity, but actually, predominantly what you're looking at is pituitary gland, amygdala, locus coeruleus, the things in the brainstem that hijack that individual. You can't have fully functioning human beings who are stressed and anxious, because we don't operate as fully functioning human beings. The two are incompatible. The center of our brain gets hijacked. And effectively, what I say to the officer cadets who have come through Sandhurst, effectively, is that you will turn into someone who is not a fully functioning human being. Effectively, you turn into a lizard. Because a lizard doesn't have the bits of the brain that we have. A lizard doesn't have a prefrontal cortex that allows them to think ahead and to establish that with emotion and attachment and create attachment with children and mothers and fathers. A lizard doesn't have that. A lizard basically has a brainstem, the bit at the back at the bottom that looks like a bit of cauliflower or broccoli. That's my bit that allows me to have balance and coordination, my cerebellum. And it has the bit, if it's got eyes, above that, which is my occipital lobe, which allows me to see. So those are the things that operate within an environment where you're very stressed out. And you can see that on those two brain scans on the left-hand side, those MRI scanners, that have shown that the amygdala, locus coeruleus, pituitary gland are being hijacked and turning somebody into a lizard. So actually reducing the levels of anxiety and stress looked like something that we could use in terms of being able to pinpoint how we increase resilience for people. And you're thinking, well, come on, we must have stressful environments to be able to operate. Okay, have stressful environments, but don't have them all the time. Don't have them all the time. Because one of the things that I want you to think about is actually about, are you ready for race day? When you think about your teams, are you continually pushing your teams to a limit where they are burnt out? You're pushing them. And when it comes to race day, when it comes to the time and the place where they need to act, are they already tired out because you have put so much stress and anxiety within them as a leader, as a manager? You need to think about that. You need to go through a cycle where there is enjoyment and then there is rest, and then you create situations where we're getting ready for the stressful, anxiety-creating situations. But we practice those things, we begin to develop our own tools and techniques to deal with those situations. So next one, that building block down at the bottom, where if it falls away, the whole thing falls down, is sleep. Let's look at sleep in a little bit more detail. Now, if you look at a sleep cycle, it's a neurological reset. It's the way that we get our brain to fully function better because we've got a reset. And normally, that reset happens in not less than 6.5 hours. Now, and that's not me saying to you, you've got to get 6.5 hours sleep each night. In fact, some of the evidence is saying you should get more sleep each night. There was, for a long time, people used to say, oh yeah, you've got to get 8 hours sleep. And then there were people like Margaret Thatcher and Winston Churchill who'd say, oh, no, 2 hours, and I sleep through during the day. Well, the evidence would say, actually, that's not a good way to operate as a human being. Every living organism on this planet sleeps. There's a reason for that. It's because sleep generates this neurological reset. And within humans, that is really, really important for our performance. If you want to perform well as a human being, you need to get sleep. You need to get that neurological reset. And we're talking quality and quantity of sleep. Now, what we did discover here at Sandhurst is that we did some sleep research, and we discovered that actually our officer cadets here were getting really bad levels of sleep, between 4.5 and 5.5 hours per night. But then you looked at the research, this was off Fitbit data, you looked at the research and you realised, well, that included the average where it was weekends as well, and most of the time the cadets were catching up with sleep over weekends. We're not producing high-performing individuals if we don't allow them to sleep. That comes for anybody within your organisation, within your team. If they're not getting sleep, your alarm bell should be ringing, because that's going to be a major factor in their own psychological resilience. Why I said 6.5 hours? If you look at a general sleep cycle in terms of the stages of rapid eye movement sleep that you go through, you need about 6.5 hours to go through those at least 4 stages of REM sleep. That's what you need. Now, you think about sleep in terms of its neurological activity. You know, I said to you earlier on that I went in to see a patient and I fell over and I had an epileptic seizure on the floor. Well, REM sleep looks a bit like an epileptic seizure. If you weren't asleep, if your body hadn't been cut off from the brain and during that sleep process, actually you'd be twitching and moving a lot of muscles in your body you didn't even know you had. When you're awake, you're using far less neurological energy than you are when you're asleep. So we know that there's something remarkable going on with regards to the brain and sleep. What are the things that happens if we don't get these sleep cycles? Well, there's a whole list of things here on the screen that really should be waving alarm bells at us. These are the benefits of having sleep. But actually talking to you about the benefits of having sleep isn't great. what I should be doing is talking to you about the consequences of not getting enough sleep. So, you go back to Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, and some of those things come out of there. One of the things he talks about is this suppressing neurological development. Suppressing neurological development because this prefrontal cortex bit, this bit that allows you to think ahead, this bit that allows you to predict the future, this bit that allows me to think about my career, about the welfare of my children, about my drive home tonight, about what might happen next with this webinar. That bit doesn't really fully develop until your mid to late 20s. About 26 years old, we're looking at in terms of the full development of a prefrontal cortex. That means people who are younger don't make great decisions because their prefrontal cortex can't really work properly because it really hasn't fully developed. That would be the process that we've got at the moment in terms of what we know about it and how it works. So you think about that in terms of prison populations. Our prison population, you go to prison at 18 years old and you can come out of prison, well, when? Well, we know that in terms of age ranges, that the prison population tends to drop off after the age of 26. So late 20s is when people are coming out of prison and not going back because they have the ability to make better decisions because they've got a prefrontal cortex that actually works. And think about it in terms of your children, maybe, or people within your life that are still teenagers or very young adults. Do they have the ability to make decisions like you do? And if they do make a decision which causes them trouble in some way, do we berate them for it? Or do we actually understand that neurologically they're not yet fully deformed? Now, if they're not getting enough sleep, if we put them in a situation where they are not getting enough quality, quantity sleep, that also means that they are not going to be fully functioning adult human beings, making good, reasoned decisions. So here's another list of things that happen when we don't get enough sleep. From increased levels of diabetes and heart conditions, and to increased mental health issues. A whole load of things here that actually mean that we don't fully function as human beings because we're not getting enough sleep. And of course, what you don't do is you don't learn and you don't remember, because a lot about sleeping for us as human beings is about learning. It's about putting things that happened the day before into its place within our memory, which means we can learn. So some of the attitudes towards sleep you have to think about as well, because attitudes towards sleep we need to look at and we need to think about, actually, are we the problem? Because if there are attitudes towards sleep that are negative, then that's bad news. If you're the leader who is sending WhatsApp messages at 10 o'clock at night, I don't want to work for your team. I don't want to work for your team because you are suddenly putting something into my head. If I was there on my tablet or mobile phone looking at the BBC News app with my blue screen filter on at 10 o'clock at night, and suddenly a message comes through from my boss, now you're spiking my thinking ahead. Now possibly you've sparked my adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol levels from the centre of my brain. You are impacting upon my psychological resilience because you're messing actually with my ability probably to fall asleep. Don't send messages late at night. That's not conducive to good operational teamwork, because actually it's not just about you and what you're thinking there and then. Think about that. Think about actually your own attitude towards sleep and how you encourage that within your own team. Also, there's this attitude about coffee. We live in a coffee generation. There's coffee shops all over the place. You can go into Starbucks, you can go into Costa, there might even be on site, there might be Costa machine actually in your office or something. But what we're failing to realise is that actually what we're doing is messing around with some of the neurochemicals that actually enhance and promote sleep. Adenosine is one of those things. Adenosine sort of clears up during the sleep process, and so it's at very minimal levels when you wake up. And then it gradually grows and grows and grows in terms of levels throughout the day until it saturates your brain and you just go, sleep. What caffeine does is it sits in the same neurological molecules, in the same receptors. Caffeine sits in the same receptors that adenosine would fit into. But caffeine doesn't last that long, and it washes out. And then as soon as it washes out, adenosine goes, woo! And it gets back into that receptor. And that's when you faceplant the steering wheel on the way home because you're too knackered and you've been drinking coffee all that time. So coffee isn't a great thing to be having. So there's some little tools and techniques that you can use to get this full recharge through sleep. One of those things is don't sleep during the day. Don't sleep during the day. Leave your sleep till night time. Cut out caffeine after 1500 hours and make sure you're not having alcohol, which you think is helping your sleep, but in fact it's not helping your sleep at all. It's deteriorating the quality of the sleep that you get. And blue light filters on your phones and your tablets. Make sure that blue light filter is on your phone or your tablet. It comes on at latest 2100 hours, 9 o'clock at night, and it's 80% light filter. Of course, there's other things that you can use. You can go to bed at the same time each night. That's a good thing to do. Make it a routine. Make sure your bedroom is only geared up for sleep. That is, you haven't got a TV in there, you haven't got other things in there that are distracting. The bed is where you sleep. And there's other things that you can use, there's apps, etc. you can use like Headspace that can generate good sleep or generate you getting off to sleep quicker. Now the last thing I really want to talk about in some detail is the social element in terms of the building block. I'm not going to talk about physical fitness, but I am going to talk about the social element because this becomes really important in terms of that building block of psychological resilience. We are a social species. We need other people to actually help our lives along. Now, some of the questions I ask officer cadets here halfway through their training experience is I get them to reflect on some of the things that may have been happening. And this is part of the research that we're doing as well. When things begin to get difficult, when they're tired, and when they are really searching towards finding it or achieving their own goals, are they looking after each other? How is this going to affect their behaviours as a leader later on? And when I ask them about these things, some interesting things come out. One of those things is about contempt. Now, contempt could be easily recognised in terms of facial expression. I'm going to take my glasses off. Some of you will recognise this from parents, bosses, partners. One bit of research I read said that these facial expressions are the number one thing that correlates with divorce. So if these things are happening within your relationship, watch out. So, rolling the eyes, shaking the head, a tongue in the cheek. Those are signs of contempt. Those signs of contempt actually reveal something a little bit more than you would think. You make up your mind whether you think these individuals are showing contempt at this time, but the important for leaders is that if I'm a leader within your group, within your team, you follow my lead and hopefully you like me. If you like me, you are more likely to trust and respect me. We know those three things are correlated. Liking, trust and respect. So you follow my lead because you like, trust and respect me, and you're more likely to copy me. As you do that, I might start to see an individual within the team who I've got a negative bias towards for no particular reason. So no reason, that's got any massive evidence for it, just because I don't like that individual maybe. And that negative bias can come out in my verbal and visual signs of contempt. The visual signs of contempt that I've shown you on the screen there, or my verbal signs of contempt in terms of the words that I use. Now, if you're seeing that and hearing that, unconsciously, other people around me are receiving the message that my behaviour of contempt is perfectly acceptable. If that's perfectly acceptable, then other people will start to do it. That becomes the norm. Toxic contempt within the team becomes norm. Rolling the eyes, shaking the head, contemptuous language towards each other, that becomes the norm. And what you get is social isolation. Social isolation of the individuals who are on the receiving end of that contempt. Now, within a high-performing team, you can't have that. You can't have that in a gold-winning rowing team. You can't have it in a World Cup winning rugby team. You can't have it in a football team. You can't have it in a team at work. Toxic contempt can't become the norm because it leads to social isolation, and that means that somebody's psychological resilience will be failing. So, we've done sleep and social support, if you like. Those two blocks at the bottom of the building block of psychological resilience. We've done goal achievement, and we've done cognitive strategies. We've looked at those sorts of things. The one that I'm not going to focus on because it's not my area of expertise is physical health and well-being. You can find out lots about those sorts of things yourself. There are other people who look into those sorts of things. I'm a psychologist. I look at brains. I don't look at the way that people's bodies operate effectively. What I would say is this. We have to think about why we should be doing this. Now, there's loads in the world of psychology, there was loads of evidence about why people broke. But there was not that greater evidence in terms of why people were performing really, really well. So we went from the image on the left to discovering what mental disorders were and how people operated with bipolar disorder or ADHD or whatever it might be, to things on the right. Positive psychology looked at people's beliefs, their expectations, the things I was talking to you about on that coaching cycle. What are people's goals? What are their beliefs about themselves? What are their expectations? How does that affect their mood and their attitude? And if that affects their mood and their attitude positively, they're more likely to take good actions and get good results. Now, there may be a perception that within a recruitment aspect, particularly within a place like Sandhurst, that we're dealing with Ferraris. We're dealing with people who are well-polished individuals who come from good schools and universities, who have been cared for by their parents and polished in the garage. That's not always the case. We don't always have Ferraris. And if you look at the military as a whole, we certainly don't have Ferraris. We have a lot of people who have come from different backgrounds where they've suffered. They've suffered from, some very common things. It's fairly common to be brought up in a one-parent family or to have a parent. But do these things actually all weigh up to somebody being more resilient? The more experiences they've had where actually life has been disrupted in some way, whether it's divorce within the family, or whether it's bad parenting, or whether it's bad schooling, or whether it's abuse of some sort, do those things add up to make somebody more resilient? Do you go through life experiencing these things and becoming more resilient? Well, probably not. If you read this behind me, what we've got is a situation where there are a load of things that appear together, and if too many appear together, you are not going to be a psychologically resilient person, because probably your cognitive strategies have all broken down and you've learnt to be a very different sort of person. But maybe one or two of these things have helped you become more resilient? So what we do know is that people who go through experiences in life where there are resilience issues, too many of them break you. A few of them might actually help you become more resilient because you begin to learn to adapt. But there is no manual. You can buy all these Haynes manuals. They're not that useful because there is no manual, because we're all vastly different. And there are some things that come out in the press about the work that we do in terms of the British Army and the British military, looking at how we deal with mental health issues. This is just from a year ago, from February 2019, looking at our ability to actually deal with mental health within the Army. There was some bad press there. There were some fascinating stats that came out from the Parliamentary Select Committee. 411 people dismissed from the military, so that's Tri-Forces. 411 people dismissed from the military or lost their jobs from the military because of mental disorders. 411 doesn't sound a lot, but when you think about it, actually in terms of numbers, we just fill Wembley Stadium and you've got 411 people on the pitch. That's not great. And also in terms of people who are making their way into the IAP scheme, the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, we've got a huge amount of veterans going into those services. So some of that evidence points towards the fact that actually maybe soldiers aren't coming forward and talking about breaks in their psychological resilience. Now, that will be the same within the organisation and where you are, because actually human beings as a whole aren't great about talking about things that don't go so well or things that aren't going well in their head. We've got a generation that are coming through that are better at it. When you think about schools now, they've got pastoral care, we've got a whole load of situations where people are coming from an organisation, a schooling, educational organisation, where they've been asked to think about it, talk about it openly. And when they come into organisations that are old and rigid and they do talk about it, sometimes people go, "Ooh, really? Can't really talk about that." So that's why it becomes important for us to look at these things and actually look at performance. So my key points from this presentation are this. The cognitive patterns that we've got are really, really important, and you can learn those. Sleep, social respect and support, physical health and goal setting, and your own personal advancement within that goal achievement all build up your psychological resilience. Training to failure is important, but you have to train also a cognitive explanation and coach around it so that it lowers stress hormones and it increases persistence. And when you consider your own performance and that of your team, you've got to treat each other as athletes. Make sure you don't burn each other out before race day. Make sure actually you're building up for something and you're giving people rest and they're enjoying bits of what they do to make sure that they get the best out of the working environment. And when you're thinking about social drivers of resilience, look out for something like contempt, which actually is an indicator of resilience failing. So that's it from me. There will be questions that I'll be taking so that you can submit your questions, and then we can go from there in terms of things that you've thought about during the presentation. Thanks very much.
Langley Sharp here from the Centre for Army Leadership. Gareth, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating talk. We've got about 25 minutes. So I'm keen to dive straight into some of the questions and unpack some of your discussion today. I was seized by your earlier comment right at the beginning of your presentation when you reflected on your time as a police officer, saying that you focused probably too much on the task to the detriment of the team and the individual. And we know from our own leadership doctrine that getting that balance between task, team, individual is the secret to success. Do you think that the Army places enough emphasis on development of the individual, and particularly in terms of resilience? Do we do enough to develop our leaders, their own resilience, and how they can develop the resilience of the people they are leading? And you mentioned the mental resilience training, which is clearly a very positive step forward. And aside, a question to that, what else can we learn from other organisations in this regard?
So, honestly, I don't think we do. But the good news is we're getting much better at it, and I think the journey to turn a big ship around like the Army, it takes such a lot of people to be behind a change for good, such as coaching, for example, coaching behaviours that focus a lot more on the individual and will help psychological resilience of the team. It takes a long time for people to really get to grips within an organisation like this, because there's obviously a lot of people who are not able to see necessarily the benefits of it, or have never practiced it, and it's never been part of their normal day-to-day practice. So it takes the new people to come in and to change that around, and other champions who are commanding officers, senior people within the organisation to really champion those changes. So we are getting better of it. I think that's a natural progression of change, of generational change, but also in terms of the science that we are looking at, and the things that the Centre for Army Leadership are pushing out as well. You're pushing out evidence all the time to say, look, this is how we can get better things out of people. So we don't, but we're getting better at it.
Thanks, Gareth. I'm going to pick up on a couple of points you mentioned there. You talked about our senior leadership. And we've got a question here from Paula Strange, who asks that, conscious that you focus very much on junior leadership at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, but what advice do you have for our senior leaders and how they can better promote mental resilience for the benefit of the whole Army?
Firstly, hi, Paul. I would say we have to lead by example. And that example comes down to the little things. You know, like I was saying about not sending messages at 10 o'clock at night, not expecting everybody in at the same time as you're in, and leaving the office at the same time as you're leaving the office. You have to look after the team that you lead in the same way as you would look after your family, because you want them ready for race day. You want them ready for the time when you need them to be ready. And I think a lot of the time that toxic leaders are being identified, it's where they are doing behaviours that to them are normal, to them are just the standard thing that they do from day to day. But what they don't realise is they're putting enormous expectation upon those people around them.
Thanks, Gareth. And picking up on your comments on generations and the generational differences, is there evidence to suggest there is generational differences in resilience? You know, people talk about the younger generation being, the snowflakes. Is there credible evidence to suggest that is the case? Or is resilience resilient to generational change?
There is a pattern throughout history. If you look at classical writers and even Shakespeare, you'll see comments in there about younger people, younger generations, and about how different they are, and about the frustration that adults have had with younger generations. So it's very easy for adults to pick up on differences in younger generations. I would say the differences are in the expectations and the ability to talk about things that a lot of older members of staff in any organisation, not just our own, not just within the military, not just within the Army, have, which is, if I go to secondary school now
there'll be a pastoral care unit or somebody there who's employed full-time to talk to me as a student about any anxieties or resilience issues that I might have that might be affecting my performance within the school, or might be affecting my relationships at home. And then I go to a university, and the same applies. There's a counselling centre or a welfare centre, and I'm encouraged as a student to go and visit that centre and seek out one-to-one coaching, to be involved in groups where you talk openly about things. And then if I join an organisation like the Army, and that doesn't happen, if it doesn't happen, then my expectations of what is normal are suddenly thrown out. And really, I think there's definitely a change in terms of the way that people are expecting to be able to talk about these things and not be looked at as being alien when they do. So there's that as a generational aspect. And I think, you know, in terms of, you know, their use of social media, the way that that you quickly get responses to anything emotional that you put onto any online forum, then surely there's going to be differences there, because their norm is not my norm. I'm 51 years old. I do not have the same experiences as them. But if I seek to understand what it is they expect and what it is they want, then I can be less dismissive of it and more engaging with it.
Thanks, Gareth. I've got a question here from Andrew Todd. He said, you mentioned the importance of senior NCOs. How do you create the conditions to change the mindset and the behaviours of cohort that traditionally think resilience is just manning up?
Training. It's got to be education, 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 isn't it? We've got to be in a situation where we should be educating our junior NCOs before they become senior NCOs, junior NCOs to look out for things in their colleagues where, for example, you know, the example I would use is in the British Army now, in military across the UK and Europe, there's a pattern of accommodation which is mirroring university accommodation. You go into a modern accommodation block. It's 6 rooms off a corridor with a little communal area off the end. It's highly possible that, and likely, that some of the members of the unit are going to be getting into their room, shutting their door, getting open their PlayStation or whatever it is, you know, whatever gaming console they're using, and not going to scoff, not going to food, not using the good facilities that are there in terms of their diet and their health. They're living on Kit Kats and Coca-Cola. What are the junior NCOs doing about that? Because we're getting someone who is socially isolating themselves, probably disrupting their sleep because they haven't got a blue screen filter on their TV where they're playing their game console. They're probably staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning. They're not getting good quality quantity sleep. They're not getting the right diet. They're socially isolating themselves. You've got 3 building blocks there of psychological resilience that have already weak. And then we expect them to perform, and we wonder why they're not performing. If we educate junior NCOs, we can change the way that our senior NCOs think about it.
Thanks. We've got a question about cognitive strategy and your discussion about optimism versus pessimism. And the benefits of optimism, particularly in terms of response to failure, are pretty evident. But could there be weaknesses in optimism, in that an optimist may maybe leave things to chance, maybe doesn't plan properly, whereas a pessimist naturally questions, naturally challenges, and therefore is more susceptible to creative thinking and working through the problem?
There's a number of things about that. I think that it's entirely normal for human beings to be motivated by fear. So if you were self-employed right now and you were thinking about, you know, how your business is going to reset and how you're going to get work and pay the mortgage and pay the food bills, etc., you'd be motivated entirely by fear, and you'd be putting your plans together, planning based on pessimism of the future falling apart, possibly. That's fine. And if we were doing a military operation, if we were planning a military campaign, we'd be thinking, okay, what if this goes wrong? What if that goes wrong? We should be thinking about those things. So it's entirely normal to be motivated into a pessimistic line of thinking. The trick is to be flexible in the way that you communicate that to yourself and others. Because the three parts of optimism and pessimism were those things that Martin Seligman identified, and before him Aaron Beck, and were laid out in that grid that Simon Toy made, which was how I think about it in terms of whether I blame myself about when something goes wrong, or do I pat myself on the back when something goes right. So there's nothing wrong with patting yourself on the back when something goes well, and we don't do enough of that. So that's part of being an optimist. So you can, when something is going well, credit yourself for it. Now, we have a great value on humility in this world, and particularly within the army and the military. It's a powerful thing to have, humility. So I don't expect people to go, hey, look at me, look what I've done, because people don't like that. But you say it to yourself. It's about what you say to yourself. And if something goes right, well, we can probably do that again. If we've got all the things in place, if we've done the planning right, we can probably do that again. And that means that it will affect other things as well, because if we get this right, it will have a positive effect on something else. So to be motivated by fear and putting plans in place to ensure that the worst doesn't happen is fine. That's great. Making sure that you communicate optimism to yourself and then to your team. Because what I want is a boss who actually has a good, resilient team by identifying when people are doing well and identifying them and saying, you're doing this and I like it, this is good, thank you. Appreciation for job done. That's one of the things that we know from occupational psychology research is about the motivating factors at work. I want to feel appreciated for the job that I do, because often I don't congratulate myself. So if you're congratulating me for things that I do well, then that's good. That's optimistic, positive behavior. And if you say to me, do you know what, you're doing well at this, and I know that you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, we can probably do this again because you've done it, you've shown you can do it once. That's optimistic language. So be driven by fear, that's natural. Do the planning to make you feel better about what might be ahead in terms of level of anxiety. Think ahead about it in terms of, okay, so I've got that covered, I've got this covered. But communicate optimistically to your team. If you don't, if you communicate as a pessimist, you blame them for things that go wrong, the future looks gloomy, and everything is being affected by the bad performance of the team, then if you do that consistently, you will diminish the resilience of your own team.
Thanks, Gareth. I've got a question here from James Hood, who wants to know a little bit more about sleep and the impact on performance. And the impact is, I guess, fairly evident, and we've probably all experienced it ourselves in training and on operations. But the very nature of the operations that we conduct, they're high intensity, and we can't necessarily dictate the pace of those operations. And tempo is key, and certainly our tempo being faster than that of the opponent. So therefore, the luxury of sleep is not always there. Can we, and indeed should we, be trained to be more resilient with less sleep?
So that's an interesting thing, is that if you're trying to train people to operate effectively with diminished sleep, they won't remember stuff that they're being taught. So it's a paradox. You can't sleep deprive people and then expect people to learn. The two just do not fit together. So what you can do is train people whilst they're getting enough sleep, good quality, quantity sleep, about what to do when they don't get enough sleep. And that means then in training, within training somewhere like Sandhurst or any of the phase 1 training centres that we have, is that when people go on exercise and they do experience sleep deprivation, within that exercise environment, they're learning what that feels like, and they understand in some way how their performance diminishes. But in those exercise environments, it's in the exercise environments where we try and reflect reality. We sleep deprive people within those environments, but when they get back into the training centre, we don't continue to sleep deprive them. We then get them back into a proper sleep routine so they can learn. Then we can reflect on the things that actually happened during the exercise. Whilst people have then got better operational functioning brains, we can go back and we can say, okay, so this is what happened. And people will sit there and go, really? Did that happen? I've got, one, I didn't remember that, or I remembered it in a completely different way because they were sleep deprived. But the training has to be done within that balance. Train people, help people learn by getting them enough sleep, replicate reality in an exercise environment, show people what it's like, and then give them the tools and techniques that they can use effectively within the operational environment.
Thanks, Gareth. Final question, conscious of time, and I just want to talk about testing for resilience. There's been a couple of questions come in about 360-degree reporting and other methods of assessing individuals' performance. But specifically in terms of resilience, can you test an individual's resilience like we do test other qualities? And if so, how do we do that, and how often should we do that through one's career?
I think, as you'll hear in many military training establishments, you'll hear senior NCOs complaining about attitude. There's a poor attitude around here. Maybe that's a measure of resilience. Can we test resilience on an academic level? Yes, we can. Qualitatively, in terms of interviewing people throughout their training experience, and quantitatively in terms of giving them surveys to do and getting the data from those, and asking them about things like self-esteem, confidence, expectations of success and failure, and their own levels of mood, and correlate that with levels of sleep, the social relationships that they are having, and their own physical health as well. So we can correlate all those things together and measure resilience in some way. That reflects the equation that I put up during the webinar. So we can measure it. I think on a day-to-day basis, the obvious measurement comes out in somebody's behaviour or somebody's attitude. And we have an emotional response to that often, which is often negative, because often we take it personally that their attitude is negative against us or against the task that they've been given, and we need them to operate faster and more effectively and more efficiently. But actually getting under the skin of that and understanding what the resilience issues are, that's when we're relying then upon, obviously on our chain of command, our junior NCOs, our senior NCOs, to actually feed back to us about what are the things that are impacting upon people. We can measure it. We don't measure it enough. We need to do more research on it. That's what I'm hoping to do more of during my time at Sandhurst. But I think it's on a day-to-day basis, we measure it instinctively on attitude and people's behaviours.
Gareth, thank you very much indeed. You've clearly ignited the audience because the questions are flowing through, but unfortunately we've hit our time limit, 12:30, so we've got to draw to a close now. Before I say my final thanks, I'd just like to make a few advertisements to the wider audience. Apologies for some technical difficulties right at the beginning of the presentation. They will be rectified, and this presentation will be put onto our YouTube channel, which will join the catalogue of our previous speaker series and conferences available on that means. So please do take a look. That'll be on this afternoon. We've got 2 events coming up in 2 weeks' time. We've got a further webinar. Graham Taylor, former regular officer, now a reservist, who's been working in the leadership field for a number of years, will be joining us. He'll be talking about self-awareness, leadership styles, and how to develop your own leadership style, particularly in crisis. And he's been working at one of the Nightingale hospitals of late, so he's got some recent experience to bring to bear. Week after that, on the 20th of May, for our activists, Cal activists only, we've got an activist workshop. Coach of the Year, Joe Emerson, will be talking about group facilitation of leadership development. If you're interested in becoming a Cal activist, do have a look at our website and do drop us an email. All the details are on there. Finally, Gareth, thank you very much indeed for a thought-provoking, very thought-provoking talk. I think from my perspective, resilience is a bit of a modern buzzword, but there's a real danger that it becomes all things to all people. But I think what you've very successfully done today is cut through the noise and give us a really clear evidence-based perspective on what resilience means, particularly for the military environment, particularly for the army, but more so for us as leaders, both as individual leaders, but also developing those that we lead. Absolutely critical in our understanding. So Gareth, it's a pleasure as always to speak to you and to listen to you. Thank you very much indeed, and look forward to working with you again soon. Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you.